strike rate's very, very overrated.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Strike Rate, the cricket analytics podcast with me, Jack Hope, and Dan Weston. This week on the podcast, we're going to be talking about drafts and auctions. What's the difference between the two? How do you prepare for one? And how does analysis feed into that? Just a reminder that we want you to enjoy the show, first of all, and support the show, second of all, by liking and subscribing, following on whatever platform you found the podcast. This is our third episode. We've got plans for many more. We want your engagement, so make sure you leave a comment and all of that, and follow us on Twitter. I'm at JackHope0, and you can find Dan at SA Advantage. Dan, how are you doing, first of all?
Yeah, good. We're recording this on Sunday. We just watched England get absolutely decimated today by India in the Test match on day 4. So it was, actually quite funny.
Yeah, it was, gallows humour or hilarious if you're not English, I think, and very sad, very rage-inducing for some people. Before we get into auctions, Dan, we wanted to touch upon something else first, didn't we? So we're going to take a mini diversion into the world of Basra, thanks to a little bit of buzz that was on Twitter this week after Australian cricket broadcaster Neroli Meadows inadvertently caused a minor storm by not only tweeting about Basra but also producing a table which combined T20 Basra with ODI Basra, making the whole measurement sort of twice as useless. If you don't know what Basra is, it's an acronym for batting average, strike rate added, or some version of that. So effectively you take a batter's strike rate and their average and you add it together, and what that's supposed to give you a picture of is the overall production of a batter in white ball cricket. You'll occasionally see it come up on broadcasts and someone will say, look at this guy, he's got the highest Basra in the IPL, and you're supposed to be impressed by that. However, Dan, it's not necessarily all it's cracked up to be, is it?
No, and it's definitely not to be confused with the Iraqi city that someone tweeted me about as well. Look, it's quite a flawed metric because of several factors. First of all, and this is actually an area that I'm working on quite intensively at the moment with one of my teams that I work for, is that what I'm looking at is like the correlation between different metrics and success and failure. And actually, these two metrics aren't very well correlated. In fact, they're kind of reverse correlated, but also intertwined, if that makes sense. So a strike rate will change someone's average because obviously, if you're striking at a high rate, then you're scoring more runs per ball, which can lead to a higher average. However, the problem is that the trade-off also exists that the more aggressive you bat, the less likely you are to lose, which then reduces the average. So it's kind of like this weird intertwinement, but also just completely unrelated things. Second of all, as well, is that you're comparing a number which is typically, for T20 at least, under 30, with the number in T20 at least is typically over 130. So, like, for example, let's say you've got a batter who averages 30 at strike rate 130. So their Basra is going to be like 160. Or what happens if you've got a tail ender who averages 10 but strikes at 200, like a Rashid Khan kind of player? that makes him a better player. And like, do you know what I mean? Like, Basra is going to love someone like that. So it has massive limitations. So what I prefer, instead of if you are obsessed with these two metrics, which I don't think are the be all and end all by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, if a team was to solely use these two metrics as a guide for recruiting players, I think that'd be awful. If you're going to do it, look at it from like a mean, that's what I'm trying to think of, like how much difference to the mean deviation that they are from each one to the other. So, for example, 143 strike rate, if the mean is 130, would be 10% above the mean. That would be a much fairer way of doing it rather than comparing two numbers which are like miles different to each other. I think someone on Twitter compared it to assessing the quality of a car by adding its mileage to its miles per gallon figure or something like that. Like, and it is like really that absurd. I even saw someone like talk about like dividing the whole total by cupcakes and things like that, which is pretty crazy as well. I mean, it shows you how the irrelevance of it really is.
Yeah, I think to some extent the cream will rise to the top in that, because obviously if you do have in Basra, I mean, because obviously if you do have a really good strike rate, you'll ultimately have a really good Basra as well. But the point you make about these being two entirely separate measures, measuring entirely different things and giving you entirely different information about a player, mean that if you ever do see Basra, your first instinct is probably going to be, well, I wonder how that breaks down into average and strike rate, which is the actual information that would be valuable in that scenario. So I think it's one to treat with a little bit of caution. At best, it's going to be sort of an interesting. At best, it's going to be something interesting to note, but I don't think you'd ever want to be picking a player or not picking a player based on Basra because of that. Well,
I think
because it's not actually. Yeah, because it's a valueless proposition, basically. Well, I will say though, obviously this got tweeted up, and it was quite a funny tweet as well, because it had the Basra from T20 added to the Basra from ODI, which are entirely separate formats and have different drivers of success to some extent as well. So it made the whole thing even more meaningless. But what I will say is that it was good to see somebody from mainstream cricket broadcasting at least talking about something analytical, even if what they were talking about was effectively mumbo jumbo. Like it's the first step to people understanding more about the game is to ask questions and put ideas out there, and if those ideas are wrong, so be it. We've all had bad ideas, and
for sure.
I'm sure we will in the future. So don't crush people's dreams.
But the thing is the vast majority of these commentators will have at some point been offered services by people like me who could have helped them in this area, like in the last 5 years. So realistically, there's no excuse for anyone to be basic at understanding data, because the services are out there.
Yeah,
and I also I tweeted about this at the time. I also think that people who are commentating, who are using such kind of flawed methodologies, is actually quite a big kick in the teeth for the people out there who are doing much better work than that and not getting any recognition whatsoever.
Yeah, I think it's a journey though. Like, these things filter in. So I'm going to take the more optimistic take, and you can take the hardcore analytical one. Dan, I said we're going to get into auctions, and we're going to do that. So we're covering it's quite it's auctions and drafts. So we're going for a big topic area here.
Yeah.
I suppose this episode, when we're talking about preparation for one, from largely from your perspective, I suppose one of the key things to talk about here is the difference between an auction and a draft. So do you want to kick us off with a really brief summary of the two and what the differences are?
Yeah. So throughout this discussion over these next episodes, I want to kind of make one basic assumption to start with, and that is that every team has a level budget and that they're willing to spend all of that level budget, because it just makes life so much easier to make that assumption. And 99% of the time it's true as well. You might get the odd team who just don't want to spend anything at the auction, but it doesn't happen very often. Okay, so differences between the two. Well, the primary difference is that at an auction, the free market determines how much that player will sell for, or effectively their market value at that stage, on that day, at that time. And so it's a purer way of identifying player valuation than a draft, where you have to pick a player in a certain salary bracket and you don't get to negotiate that price. The second thing as well is that in an auction, and I wouldn't unnecessarily recommend doing this, but it's undisputable, that's a fact, is that if you want to buy a certain player, 100% you can. You just make sure you've got more money than everyone else, and you're willing to do that. If you want an individual in your squad, you can get him. However, in a draft, unless you've got first pick in the first round, which obviously most of the time is you're fighting with 6 or 8 other teams to have that luxury, you can't guarantee that. So you can't look at players in a draft as much as like a must-have, if that makes sense. And I don't really value the concept of must-haves probably as much as a lot of other people. I'd much rather use depth charts and things like that. But effectively, that's a huge difference straight away. So, for example, and drafts can take a few different courses in terms of how they're structured. So, in 100 draft, for example, it's done as a snake, and anyone who is interested can Google snake draft to understand a bit more about that. I think it's used in like American fantasy sports quite a lot and things like that as well. So if you're first pick in round 1, your last pick in round 2, first pick, and then first pick again in round 3, that type of thing. So it goes in like a kind of snake structure. In the PSL, which is a model that I much prefer in terms of draft structure, the rounds are drawn in advance at random. I think a couple of weeks before, in advance of the draft, so you know which pick you're going to have in each round. And it could be like, round 1 you might get lucky and have pick 1, and the same in round 2, but then in round 3, 4, 5 you might have pick 6 or something like that. Like that, it could be anything. You don't know where you're going to be until this pre-draft draw is performed. And I think that I prefer that because it's a bit less predictable and it can be quite random in structure. And I think it's got more in it in terms of those people who want to think outside the box.
Yeah, so I follow up to that then, because there are, we've got auctions, we've got drafts, but there's another level to this as well. We've got mega auctions and mega drafts in a sense, and mini auctions and mini drafts. So think about the IPL here for people that maybe don't follow it that closely. I assume most of the listeners will, but just to explain it, every few years there's a new auction cycle, and pretty much all the players get thrown into a big pot, and teams more or less start from scratch. But in the intermediary years, so each year between those two mega auctions, there will be the chance for players to cut and add, chance for teams rather to cut and add players to sort of refresh their squads on an annual basis. Really quickly to end part 1, Dan, can you explain the dynamics and the differences between those mega drafts and mega auctions and the mini versions of them that happen each year?
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to kind of participate in a few different types of those auctions. So hopefully I can give some interesting insight to listeners and viewers about that type of thing. So first of all, mega auction in the IPL 2022, the teams were allowed to retain no more than 4 players from their existing roster. And they needed to, if they wanted to retain 4, they could recruit another 21 at auction to make their squad of 25, maximum of 21 to make the maximum squad of 25. At Punjab, we actually only retained 2 players. So we had a little bit more shopping to do in the mega auction and a slightly bigger budget to throw around as a result. Now, effectively at this point, you're not far off starting from scratch, right? We had 1 pacer and one batter. That was it. And that's a you can really go from the ground up again in terms of working out an identity for a squad. How you're not, basically, the best thing about it is you're not dealing with the mistakes that other people have made. So usually when you've gone into a team in, say, a mini auction environment, say like you're brand new as a head coach or head of recruitment or something like that, you can't make wholesale changes very quickly. You've got to deal with the players that the other coach has already picked, kind of thing, or the other regime has picked. So you might have to make sort of small changes rather than big ones until the mega auction comes about. So I always think it's harsh in the IPL environment to judge a coach until they've had a mega auction to recruit players, basically, or if they're a big part of the recruitment. So Mega auction, we're going from scratch. We can build an identity very, very quickly. So what I tried to do in the work that I did with Punjab, we had an identity where I think all of us in the sort of auction group were very aligned to, which was we wanted to play very attacking cricket and entertain the fans, but also play a winning style. And that all kind of correlated into the squad that we picked. Whether teams generally look to recruit certain players based on identity is certainly a moot point. I think teams could do a lot more to do that. And then you go into a different environment, which will be the mini auction. And because you can only make small changes to your squad, there's a completely different dynamic. So in a mega auction, you might find it's quite, because you've got to buy 23 players or 20 plus players. You've got to make sure that your money goes a long way and you can't bust your budget too quickly. Whereas in a mini auction, you might only be looking at 2 or 3 players, and you might have 30 crore to spend or something like that. So you can actually overpay for a skill set that you particularly want, and there will be a skill set. So, for example, a genuine all-rounder or a world-class pacer who bowls power play and death or something like that, or those type of players. They're going to get, if there's only a few of them in the auction hall, or even less, maybe like 1 or 2, and 5 teams want them, the bidding's going to go crazy in that mini auction environment, which is why you see players get stupid bids like what we saw in the IPL for like Mitchell Stark and Pat Cummins. The teams just knew that there was no other real alternatives for them in that situation, so they just went, right, well, we're going to have him no matter what, until they basically run out. And to some extent, that's the same dynamic in a mini draft as well. You might identify like a gap in your squad that so for example, 100, right? You can retain no more than 10 players. So you've got the crux of your squad assembled before you enter the draft room. Obviously, I think there's been times where like a couple of teams have retained far less than 10, but on the whole, that's generally what happens. If you've got a kind of half decently constructed squad, you're often retaining sort of 8 to 10 players minimum. And yeah, from there, you're looking to fill specific gaps in your squad. You're not looking to say, okay, well, he's a good player, we'll have him. You're looking to say, I want this player who can play this role, because that's what we don't have. And so therefore, you might have to pay, like, say, top bracket for someone because like they're literally the only player in the draft list who offers all of the things that you need in one package. Doesn't mean necessarily that you value them as the best player in a draft, but they become as kind of, I don't really like the term must have, but they become kind of mandatory because of the fact that they're only that type of skill set. So I'll give you an example. You might want a left-handed wicketkeeper who can bat in various places, and there's not many of them, and so therefore you have to go all out and get that player before someone else does. Otherwise, then you might say that, okay, well, the balance and the structure of your squad is kind of taking a downturn if you don't get that player. So again, there's that overvaluation of players in the short term in a very competitive mini environment that perhaps you don't get in the mega environment, even in a draft, because basically in a mega environment, but it's draft or auction, you get much closer to the truer market value of a player, whereas supply and demand dynamics dictate so much in a mini auction or draft.
Great, Dan, I think that's perfect to wrap up part 1 there. When we come back, we'll be talking about how to prepare for an auction, what strategy is, and a few other dynamics. The local v overseas thing, that comes up a lot, so we'll interrogate that in some more detail. We should say as well, in part 3 of the episode, we'll be talking about, we'll be fielding questions from listeners as sourced through Twitter. So do stick around for that. And if you want to ask a question on a future show, like I said at the beginning of the episode, seek us out on Twitter. Seek out Dan on Twitter at SA Advantage, and keep an eye out for when he posts about new episodes. We'll be back in a moment.